There are several advantages and disadvantages to movie franchises. Because on the one hand, they can let many a character's story be told over a much longer span of time than is usually possible, as well as allow for a lot more world building than a single movie can ever offer. But on the flip side, if a franchise is particularly successful, it can cause the story to go on a lot longer than it should, and perhaps most notably, depict the deaths of characters who never should have been shown dying. Because death is obviously one of the most important aspects to life. So, how a specific character is shown facing it can have a heavy influence on how they're perceived, and not showing their final minutes, or even the fact that they ever died at all, can have a much larger impact than most realize. And in a day and age where franchises, and therefore the stories in them, never seem to end, this can often result in the deaths of characters that never should have died. And today, I'd like to go over this aspect to characters, and specifically when and where it's appropriate to depict them dying. And there will be spoilers for quite a few movies I bring up ahead, so in case you don't want something ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so to start off simply, as a man who's written books, I can obviously say with complete certainty that one of the most important aspects of storytelling is knowing when, where, and how a specific character should die. And that's a concept that goes all the way back to ancient Greek myths. I mean, who doesn't know the famous story of Achilles' heel? He's probably so famous because of the way he died and the message it imparts. And the same can also be said for the likes of William Shakespeare. After all, would Romeo and Juliet be so well known today if it hadn't had such a tragic ending? Because let's face it, everybody knows it ends with the two dying. That's pretty much their defining trait. If they had lived to the end, then their story simply wouldn't be as famous. And the same goes for many characters during the golden age of Hollywood. For example, when the movie Psycho is brought up, the first character most people think of is Norman Bates and his twisted relationship with his mother. But the reason many do remember Marion Crane, who is actually the main character of the first half, is because of her infamous death in the shower scene. To put it simply, if not for her death, she probably would have been seen as just another generic lead character whose movie is completely stolen by Norman Bates. But because her character is killed, and in a pretty gruesome and unexpected fashion at that, she cemented her place in cinema history right alongside him. Now you might be wondering, what's my point with all of this? That there's a time and place for certain characters to die in a story. And when done exceptionally well, like in the aforementioned cases, that death can even come to define the character and everything they're meant to represent. But at the same time, it's just as important to know when a character shouldn't bite the dust. Because once again, in an age where stories never end, that's becoming increasingly difficult. Because to go back to that last example for a second, do you really think Norman Bates would be nearly as terrifying if he had been killed at the end? No. It's that final scene showing just how sick in the head he really is that makes him so terrifying. And if he were to have died, all of the tension that climaxes in that scene would be totally lost. One could already argue that his story was continued far too long in all those unnecessary sequels, but at least they didn't commit the mortal sin of killing him off. To put it simply, just how a character's death can come to define them, they can also be just as defined by the fact that they didn't die. And this was something that was understood a lot better during the golden age of Hollywood. I mean, what do James Bond, The Man with No Name, Dirty Harry, and Harry Potter all have in common? None of them died. They're all legends that continue to live on in the public consciousness, and a major reason for that is because their death is never depicted. And because how they died isn't known, it allows their legend to live on. In fact, this can even apply to real-life people as well, with one of the most famous examples of that being Amelia Earhart. Because, let's face it, she was born in 1897. One can safely say that even if she did survive her last voyage, she's long dead by now. But it's the fact that nobody saw her die or knows how she died that causes her legend to live on, where so many of her contemporaries fell into obscurity. Because simply put, her story ended the way most legends do. She simply disappeared in the prime of her life, leaving what happened to her after that anybody's guess. So even if her death is pretty much a given by this point, from the perspective of most people, she didn't die in the way most people see it, because nothing is known about how it happened. And once again, this is exactly how many legends from the golden age of Hollywood are viewed, because their story ends with them essentially running off into the sunset to begin a new adventure. And even though it's a given they'll die someday, people don't view them that way because it's never shown. Instead, they become a mythical figure who transcends time and other mortal boundaries to become a legend whose stories are told long after they are realistically gone. Because when something doesn't have an ending, it leaves one to wonder if there was one, even if there almost certainly was. Like, for example, everybody knows Don Lockwood in Singing in the Rain, right? And part of the reason he stands as such a famous fixture of the golden age of Hollywood is because he doesn't die. His story ends with him getting everything he wanted and simply fades to black. Even though most will concede he did eventually die, especially as Gene Kelly himself did eventually kick the bucket, the fact that he isn't shown dying allows him to live on forever as one of the most famous main characters from Hollywood's golden era. Or for another example of that, just look at the legendary career of John Wayne. Because of the 150 movies he did, his character only died in 7 of them. And his lack of on-screen deaths is a major reason that he became such a legendary American figure. Because even as he himself battled cancer and even had a lung removed, all audiences saw was a tough fighter who embodied the virtues a man should have. And because his characters so rarely died and instead rode off to fight another day, he became less an actor and his characters less characters and more a legendary symbol that anybody could look up to or believe in. They were the heroes everybody wanted to believe existed and could do what they could not. And that left such an impact that this continued long after the man himself had died, because his characters continued to live on. To put it another way, if he had died at the end of most of his movies, he would simply not be viewed the way he is today. Now, as I said before, when done right, a character's death can not only come to define them, but be the reason they're so beloved and remembered at all. But that only works when the right character dies in the right fashion. And to stay on the topic of the golden age of Hollywood for a second, in order to emphasize this point, let's take a look at Charles Foster Kane. Because he famously dies at the beginning of the movie, and then his story is told via flashback. Now, once again, this is a character who's as well known as he is, mainly because he dies. But that's because his death actually serves a purpose to the story. Citizen Kane is about a man who became a huge success, but loses everything that truly matters in life as a result, which is summed up in his final word, Rosebud. So in order for his entire life to be examined and drive this point home, his story has to have an ending, and moreover end specifically the way it does. This isn't a character that died simply because Orson Welles wanted him to. His death is a very important part of the narrative. And the fact that his story is still so well known all this time later only speaks to how well Welles executed it. But as I also said before, this applies just as much the other way around as well. To go back to somebody I mentioned earlier, part of what makes Harry Potter such an iconic character and story is that he beats the odds and gets to live to the end of the story. And it's not known how he finally does die. So as a result, he becomes just as big a legend out of story as in story. And once again, this is significant because it ties into the theme of the books and movies, which is that death is unavoidable and that one should accept it instead of trying to prevent it. I even did a whole separate video on this topic, which you can find a link in the description to. But the point is, Harry Potter beat death and lived because he accepted he would die, while on the flip side, Voldemort absolutely refused to accept death and ends up dying a complete fool. So in this case, the fact that Harry lives and that makes him a legend, and that Voldemort dies and in the process takes away from his fear factor, are completely warranted and intentional because of what's trying to be conveyed. And because their respective fates are appropriate for the characters and story, it has a huge impact on the way the audience views them. But once again, this can quickly become a problem when a franchise goes on for too long, because it causes the writers to end up killing off characters whose deaths should have never been shown on screen. And for just one example of that, why do you think so many rejected Luke Skywalker's death in The Last Jedi? Because by the time Return of the Jedi had come out, Luke Skywalker and all the other surviving characters were some of the biggest legends in all of cinema. And that was exactly where their story should have ended. The Empire is defeated, and they'll make sure they don't make the same mistakes as the previous generation. They are in the prime of their lives with the brightest future possible ahead of them. Their story doesn't need to continue beyond that point, and if it were to, it would have to be one that could do justice to such legendary characters. But instead, Luke has all of his accomplishments stripped away from him, made to be pretty much the exact opposite of everything he stood for, and is robbed of a glorious end by being nothing more than an illusion and then weakly dying of overexertion without having actually fixed anything. To put it simply, this movie not only doesn't live up to the legend, it tries to deconstruct and tear him down. Now, whether or not you think The Last Jedi was a good movie is irrelevant, because regardless of opinions, it's pretty easy to see why a lot of people were upset by it. Because not only did it continue a story it shouldn't have, but did a complete disservice to how the characters were perceived by many in the process. Or for another example of that, why do you think so many people chose to ignore Captain Kirk's death in Star Trek Generations and act like his death was never shown? Because that would have been a much more appropriate end for the character. Captain Kirk is the type of character whose death shouldn't be shown, so that his legend can extend far beyond his own lifetime. And as I just pointed out, many Star Trek fans feel so strongly about that many just straight up ignore that aspect of the movie. Though what doesn't help is that, similar to Luke Skywalker, his death didn't exactly do justice to his legendary status either. In fact, you notice how even Spock's death, which was infinitely more well received and even still pretty heavily associated with the character, was arguably done a service by being brought back? Because simply put, in most other stories that would have been a complete jump the shark moment. But in this case, it's acceptable because Spock is simply that iconic of a character that his story deserved to be continued and his final fate left up in the air. What I'm trying to say here is, both Luke Skywalker and Captain Kirk's characters suffered majorly from having their stories go on for too long, resulting in them having underwhelming deaths that never should have been depicted. They don't serve the character or even the story beyond simply getting rid of them so it can continue without them. And that's simply not how characters like that should be treated. And that's only just two of many examples. But once again, that's what happens when a franchise doesn't know when to stop. And in an age of cinematic universes where seemingly every story is connected, this has only gotten worse. Even characters like Tony Stark or Black Widow, their deaths should not have been shown. Their stories should have ended with them in the prime of their lives ready to fight another day, as so many legends from the golden age of Hollywood did. Because whether or not you think the deaths themselves were appropriate for the characters, the fact still remains that it was a disservice to their legacies to show their deaths on screen. And unlike Spock, bringing them back wouldn't do any good either. Because to put it simply, a character's death has the most impact when it serves the story for them to die, as well as the fashion they die in. But when the story doesn't end, the characters end up sticking around a lot longer than they should, and end up dying a death they shouldn't be shown so that new characters can become the focus. And that's just not how legends are made. I mean, going back to what I was saying before, can you imagine if Shakespeare killed off his characters just because he was tired of them? Can you imagine if he continued the story of Macbeth and showed Macduff serving under Malcolm for a while before dying? And if you think that would actually be pretty cool, you're missing the whole point. What makes these characters so legendary and epic is the fact that they serve their role in one story. And if they're still alive by the time it's over, leaves their final fate in the hands of the reader. And that's what's missing from a lot of modern entertainment. They don't know where to end the story, and the characters and their legacies often suffer for it. Now, some might counter this by pointing out that a lot of Greek and Roman legends contain many stories that span far beyond the character's lifetime, and in many ways function closer to a cinematic universe than anything else. And while that is true, one has to keep in mind that these stories are supposed to be myths. People at one point believed that these things really happened. But also, and more importantly, that they were made up before most concepts of writing were conceived, so they can't exactly be held to today's standards of storytelling. They're legendary for their time and because their stories have been told for so long, rather than how well those stories were told. In other words, just because it worked back then doesn't mean it'll work now, as there are countless outside factors that have to be considered. But either way, the point is that death should be used more sparingly in modern movies, because this obsession with keeping stories going indefinitely has only resulted in a lot of characters dying deaths that never should have been depicted in the first place. Because as I said at the start, a character living can leave just as much of an impact as them dying, and especially if it isn't done correctly, having them die when they honestly shouldn't is only going to reflect badly on them and the writers. Now, as I also noted before, if it's genuinely a character's time to go and serves the story for them to die, then they should by all means die. As a writer myself, I would be the first person to tell you that. But it's just as important to know when a character shouldn't die and instead just ride off into the proverbial sunset. Because as I spent the whole video going over, that's actually how most legends are made, by the fact that they didn't die and their final fate isn't known. But given how stories never seem to end these days, it's really no wonder that there seem to be very few characters that reach such an iconic and legendary status anymore, since it takes away from their mystique if it's less about if they're going to die and more about when it'll happen. Okay, I think I've more than made my point with this. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you think that a given character, living or dying, has a greater impact on how the audience views them than most would believe? Or do you think that doesn't really factor into it too much and that I don't know what I'm talking about? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And like I already said a few times, you don't have to agree with anything in this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you want to, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.